So you'll notice that I played some music. In World Lit, I like to incorporate other forms of art just to get students in the mood. What I haven't done is food yet. So you heard some music. These are authentic Nigerian pants I actually got from an Igbo friend. This is from the Maasai in Kenya, but it's African. So I try and use the costume of the time, the period we're talking about. So we're talking about Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa the African, written by himself. That's a long title. The interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa the African, written by himself. His given name is Olaudah Equiano. His slave name is Gustavus Vasa. Gustavus Vasa was a Norwegian freedom fighter, and often slave names were ironic in the sense that you would have a slave named Caesar, and he was the exact opposite of somebody who had control over a lot of people. He had no control even over his own life. So a lot of times slaves were given names that kind of highlighted the lack of power that they had. So he was given the name Gustavus Vasa. So we're going to do a brief overview of the slave trade because it's important to understand. Equiano's narrative is considered the first slave narrative, and as Nick was saying earlier, he gave voice to millions of other Africans and African Americans who could not read nor write. So when we study Harriet Jacobs and Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, are unusual in the fact that they could read and write, and so they could tell their story. So the triangular slave trade starts in England. It starts in Bristol, London, and also Liverpool. So they take guns, cloth, iron, and beer to the coast of Africa. And they exchange their goods, they empty out all their cargo, exchange their goods for slaves who have been captured, kidnapped in the interior of Africa, Guinea, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, countries that are currently known as Liberia, and bring them to the coast where they are traded. So the Africans then, and some of the ships will go back to Europe with gold, ivory, spices, or hardwoods. Most of them will go to the West Indies and South America. Most of the Africans did not end up in the US. I think about 20% ended up in the US. Most ended up in South America and in the West Indies. And often they would stop there and do more exchanges, and then slaves would continue to ports like Charleston and ports in the south. Then in Charleston, they would load up. Rice was a big commodity. There were a lot of rice plantations. Maybe when we think of slaves, we think of cotton, but rice was really big. And that was introduced when they were growing indigo to use as a dye, and it wasn't going very well. And an African slave said, "We grow rice in Benin, why don't you try rice?" He may have kicked himself later for that, but then they started using rice in plantations. In Charleston, they had a lot of rice plantations. So rice, silk, indigo, tobacco, we're not at the stage of cotton yet. And then the ships would be loaded up, and that would go to England. So that's the triangular slave trade. So that's what we just went over. The first passage, textiles, so different kinds of material, alcohol, firearms, and gunpowder was in demand. And that went to Africa. The enslaved Africans crossed the Atlantic, and the ships returned to Europe with the colonial agriculture. Over 6 million enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas between 1700 and the suppression of the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, 1807, 1808. So when the abolitionists were very active in England from 1770s all the way to 1807. Does anybody know some of the figures who were really involved in abolition in England at that time?
Was it William Wilberforce?
William Wilberforce, huge key character. We have a Wilberforce University in this country, but he was very instrumental in the slave trade. He also formed the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in England, which is our ASPCA. So, very important figure. There's a museum that I visited in Hull, where he used to live. So, William Wilberforce key. Who else? Granville Sharp, very key figure. Thomas Clarkson, another key figure. So, the abolition movement was strong in England, but it took them a long time to stop the slave trade. This isn't slavery. This is just the slave trade. It took them over 20 years. They introduced a bill every year, and it was shot down every year. So why do you think Equiano wrote his narrative?
To give people an insight on, some of the things that slaves endured.
Okay, so it's a first-person narrative, so people will understand what slaves endured. He was asked to write it by abolitionists, right? So his narrative was used as a document to further and bolster the abolition movement. The same with Harriet Jacobs and Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. She had to be persuaded. She did not want to write her narrative. She was not proud of some of the things she did and some of the choices she made, and she didn't want to put it out there for the whole world to see. But she was persuaded that writing it would be very beneficial to the cause of abolition in the U.S. So 1807, 1808 was the end of the transatlantic slave trade. So you could no longer go to Africa and capture people and bring them over. But that didn't end slavery. Does anybody know when slavery ended in the British colonies and commonwealths? 1833. So they were ahead of us by 32 years because we didn't abolish slavery until 1865. So as I said, most of the Africans were taken to the European colonies in the Caribbean and South America, Brazil. So you have a large African influence in places like Haiti and Jamaica, and also in places like Brazil. So of the approximately 2 million people in the North American colonies that became the United States, about 20% were of African descent. So you have Europeans coming to this country voluntarily, right? And you have Africans coming to this country not voluntarily. And so the makeup of the country was about 20% African, but in the South, you had about 80% of the population were slaves. So in the North, it was more European descent than slaves, but in the South, it was a huge population of slaves, which may have led to some of the practices of the slaveholders and the overseers, and some of the revolts that happened. You're completely outnumbered. So if you don't treat your slaves, the thinking goes, in a certain manner, you could be in big trouble, right? So enslaved Africans outnumbered European immigrants by 3 to 1 before the end of the 19th century. Now this is from Vin Coretta, who wrote the biography, the seminal biography. This is not Equiano. Equiano the African. So he has done more, he is the expert on Equiano in the country. He teaches at the University of Maryland. He is the one that uncovered a document that seems to suggest that Equiano was not born in Africa. The document is a baptismal record, and it says Gustavus Vasa, born in South Carolina. There's a huge debate on this, and I fall on the side of believing his narrative. One quote that I don't think is in this PowerPoint is that when people write memoirs, generally if most of it is true, all of it is true. If some of it is false, a lot of it is false. But you don't generally find a narrative that 90% is true and there's one glaring
I'm
falsity.
just going to ask you if there are particular reasons to doubt portions of his narrative.
Well, this discovery of this baptismal seems to say that he's born in South Carolina. So then we would have to doubt the whole first part. If he was born in South Carolina, he wasn't kidnapped, he didn't take that trip across Africa, he didn't take the Middle Passage trip. So we have to count that whole first part as being historical fiction, not what actually happened to him. I'll give you guys a website, but Bricken Carey, who is a British guy, has both sides of the argument on his website. That's another possible topic for a research paper. And you could fall on either side, but basically what Vin Coretta himself has, the conclusion he's come to is, we will never know with 100% certainty if Equiano was born in South Carolina or if he was born in Nigeria. Now the town, Asaka, where he says he was born, those Nigerians have claimed him as their own, and you could not tell them that he was not born there, right? They have very much claimed him as their citizen. So this is a picture of a slave ship, a rendering, and as you read in the narrative, the stench was so bad that you would get sick. I mean, and people were, this is how they were treated, like worse than a dog. You have layers and layers and layers. And there's not a bathroom on the ship, or what they call the head on a ship. You have buckets, and they didn't want their slaves to die. I'm going to talk about the Zong incident in a minute. But so occasionally they would bring people up and put them on the deck so they get a little fresh air. They made them eat. If you'll remember some of the incidences where Equiano and others were flogged for not eating. They had nets so they couldn't jump overboard. One of the things we'll look at is his death wish. Repeatedly, especially in the beginning, he's hoping and wishing for death instead of living through that. So there is our buddy, Olaudah Equiano. Not this guy, this guy. So notice how he's dressed. What do you notice about him? Anything you notice? Yes?
He looks rich.
He looks rich. Good. What else? He is rich. After he
He's an
he's
African-American guy at his time.
he's not American. I don't think so. African.
African-American.
African, Afro-British. You can call him a lot of things. Some people call him African-American. I don't. Okay, what else do you notice?
Got paper in his hand.
He has actually the Bible in his hands, and it's open to the book of Acts. Why would that be?
That's the one that Job is in?
No.
Job has his own book.
Acts is the book that details the birth of the early church. So it's called the Acts of the Apostles, is the full title. So why would he have a Bible open in this picture? The same reason a politician today might say, God bless the United States of America. Keep in mind that this is,
Is it pandering? But I was kidding.
well, I wouldn't use that word, but it's knowing your audience, right? So keep in mind that this is an autobiography, it's a memoir, and everything he included had a purpose. So when you write a memoir, you can't write every incident of your life that happened. It would be way too long and way too boring. So every incident that he includes, if you think about the parts that you read, why did he talk about killing the chicken? Why did he talk about fainting on the ship? Everything had a purpose, right? And so everything in this picture has a purpose. He did convert to Christianity. He was baptized at a young age. Later on in the book, the part that you guys didn't read, he had a conversion experience. And so he was personally considered himself a Christian, but also he's keeping in mind his audience. So who is the audience for his book? Christians.
Proponents of abolition.
Good. It's abolitionists. It's not slaveholders. They're not going to read his book. That's not his audience. It's really slaveholders who are on the fence. They kind of sympathize, but they're not 100% in the camp. That's his audience. So everything he writes in the book, he's keeping his audience in mind, which is always good for a writer to do. What else?
You might say westernized.
Okay.
If he's wearing a traditional British attire.
He's got a cravat.
That would
We talked about that last week, right? So that's the scarf that you tie. And he's got the vest and the waistcoat. His hair is nicely done. He was a barber, a hairdresser later in his life. That's one of the skills he learned when he lived in England. What do you notice about his face? He's dark-skinned? Okay. So what's different about this picture, to me, is that the nose has more of a European feature than this picture. And the lips are different too. So this is a model for the book, but this is the real guy, Olaudah Equiano. So we can see a lot just by looking at the picture. We can see that he wanted to emulate a British gentleman, right? That's his model for how he wanted to appear. And again, keeping his audience in mind that he wants to come across as somebody who is erudite, well-read, somebody who reads the Bible, somebody who can be respected and listened to, right? That's why he dressed like that for his portrait. So this one is not the first edition, this is the 6th edition. There were 9 editions of his book published, which is a lot in that time period. Normally you'd only have 1 or 2 editions of a book. This was in 1793. The first edition was in 1789 in England, and in New York, the first edition was 1791. So here's the first London edition, and this is the first New York edition, 1791. He self-published, so he got subscribers, right? So you don't have this copy, but this is a list of his English subscribers. So basically, he would go around and say, Nick, you want to give me £5? And you'll get a copy of my book. Shirley, £4? Chris, I bet you could give me like 20 pounds, right? Okay, so his list of subscribers starts with His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, His Royal Highness, the Duke of York. He starts at the top, His Royal Highness, the Duke of Cumberland, and then he has earls, esquires, reverends, and women as well, Mrs. Baker, Mrs. Baines. So the list goes on and on. And these are subscribers at different areas, subscribers at Hull, subscribers at Bristol, subscribers at Norwich. So all these people gave him money so he could publish his book. That's how he published his book. So there was self-publishing a long time ago, and now we're going back to self-publishing. No Amazon, but he would go on book tours, and that's how he sold his book. So when my husband and I were in England, we were visiting Liverpool. What is Liverpool known for? A musical group? The Beatles. Liverpool is all about the Beatles. Everywhere you go, there's Beatles memorabilia everywhere. I didn't want to see the Beatles, I wanted to see Equiano. So they had an international slavery museum in Liverpool, and this is an exhibit on Equiano, and we actually saw a manuscript that he wrote in his own hand. So I was over there looking at it and I started crying, and my husband was like, "What is wrong with you?" Like, he wrote this. This was written in his hand, and it's sitting there right in front of us to look at. Really cool. So, just like you were saying, you saw the original manuscript of Beowulf. I mean, when you see a manuscript written by somebody you have studied, and it's hundreds of years old, it's awesome. Okay? So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, this is kind of the chronology of his life. Born in 1745, maybe a couple of years earlier or later, that might not be completely accurate. He was kidnapped, according to his own account, and sold to many different masters from the time he left his home till the time he reached the coast. Endured is the best way to talk about the Middle Passage, was in Barbados, and then he went to Virginia. His first master was Michael Henry Pascal, and he was renamed, as we said, Gustavus Vasa. Michael Henry Pascal, now, so a lot of the incidents that happen in the book, almost all of them, can be compared to historical documents, because you have the British Navy involved, so they have records of all these ships. They have manifests of everyone who was on the ships. Slaves were not supposed to be on the ships, because when we talk about the Somerset decision, we'll learn that slavery, you could not have a slave in England after the Somerset decision, which is down here somewhere. So he called Gustavus Vasa a servant instead of a slave in the manifest of the ship, right? So you can compare Equiano's narrative to the ship documents, and they were meticulously kept. So he was bought by Michael Henry Pascal and served in the 7 Years' War, saw some battles, and was on a ship for most of his time as a slave. He was baptized in London. That was the certificate we were talking about. And then when he thought he was going to get his freedom, now he had earned some money. What was he doing on the ship that might have earned him money that is still really popular today?
He was doing slave trades with like things that he was selling.
That was later.
He was boxing.
He was boxing, right? So he was boxing, and he would earn money for that. And also, if they took other ships, a prize it's called, they would share the money with everybody on the ship. So he had money. He thought he was going to be set free. And at the end of the part you guys read, his slaveholder, who he had really come to look at as a mentor and almost a friend, just sold him, shocked him and sold him to Robert King, who was a Quaker. What do you know about Quakers?
Pacifists.
They're pacifists, and they don't own slaves. So he was a good slaveholder, and he was able to, this is I think what you were referring to, Omar, he would go between the West Indies and America and sell things on the side on his own. He had permission to do that, saved up enough money to buy his own freedom. When we look at Harriet Jacobs next week, she refused to buy her own freedom, though she could have. So again, this is two different views. As a slave, am I going to, in a sense, legitimize slavery by paying for myself or not? He made the decision, I want my freedom, this is the best way to get it, I've got the money, I'm going to do it.
I could be mistaken, but it isn't the case that, at least for some portion in Britain, slaves were only slaves for a portion of time, and then their freedom was given?
Well, as I said, after the Somerset decision, once you were in England, you were not a slave.
If you were certain.
So I don't know about timing. I'm not sure about that. Could be. So through that petty trade, he saved enough to buy his own freedom. He did one last mission for his old master, just out of the goodness of his heart, and he shipwrecked in the Bahamas. He was shipwrecked. He was on a ship that was caught between two ice floes and almost squashed the ship. He almost drowned a few times. He's almost like a cat. He had 9 lives, right? He almost died several times. He traveled all over the world, and he loved being on a ship, even though he couldn't swim. So he went to Italy and Turkey, and then we get the Somerset decision. So this is Granville Sharp, who I'd mentioned earlier, who's an abolitionist, and he went before the Earl of Mansfield. I got to tell you a little bit about the Earl of Mansfield, because he also figures in the Zong incident. So the Earl of Mansfield is a judge, and what's interesting about him, he's married, they didn't have any kids. A nephew of his had we don't know, had a relationship with a slave, and they had a daughter. The Earl of Mansfield ended up raising that daughter. So this biracial girl is living in his house alongside one of his grandnieces. There was a movie that came out about 7 years ago called Belle, B-E-L-L-E, which nobody saw except those of us who love Equiano, which is a small number of people. And it's all about this girl, Belle, who is his nephew's daughter. So picture this, that you're a judge and you're making judgments about the lives of Africans, and you have a girl who's half African living in your house. And I think that had an influence on him, which is why I think it's important. The Somerset decision, the Earl of Mansfield said, there is no positive common law for slavery, and there's no law that said slavery is legitimate. Hence, if you bring a slave to England, once they get on English soil, they cannot be a slave. That was a huge decision, and that was in 1772, several decades before the abolition of the slave trade. Then Equiano goes on the Arctic Passage. He goes up almost to the North Pole, looking for a way to get to India. He sails for Spain, has visions of Christ, and this is a less laudable part of his life. He actually worked for a slaveholder on a slave plantation, kind of as the overseer, which might be a little shocking, and I don't totally understand that. He helped him establish a plantation and Christianize the Indian population. He was there less than a year. He didn't like what he saw and what his fellow workers were doing. He returned to London. Then we have the Zong massacre in 1781. So what would happen was, so the slaves were considered property, and the slaveholders would insure the slaves. So if something happened to them, they'd get money. On the Zong, which was the name of the ship, the slaveholders claimed that they were running out of water. It was determined later that they were not running out of water, but some of the slaves were sickening, and they threw about 120 of the slaves overboard. And then they wanted to get their insurance money. The jury found for the slaveholders and said they should get money for the slaves, even though basically they massacred them. They just threw them over into the water. The Earl of Mansfield, here he comes again, on appeal said this verdict can be appealed. We actually don't know if the slaveholders got any money, and we don't know if there was another trial. So that's all we know, but this was a huge incident. It's called the Zong massacre, and also more fuel for the abolitionists, that you would consider somebody property to the point where you would throw them overboard just to get the money for them. Equiano is in Philadelphia. At one point, a lot of the American slaves were saying, when slavery is over, or even now, we want to go back to Sierra Leone. They had a repatriation effort for Sierra Leone. He was in charge of that for a short time until he was dismissed. Helped organize Sons of Africa and presented the anti-slave trade petition to England's Queen Charlotte, the wife of King George III, who we know because of our relationship with him during the Declaration of Independence and everything else. So the abolition movement is going strong, but again, it'll take a couple of more decades. So he's in the abolition movement, he's presenting this petition, then he writes his interesting narrative. Same year the French Revolution begins. It's printed in Dutch, it's printed in New York. He marries English woman Susan Cullen. As I mentioned, they had 2 daughters, Anna Maria and Joanna. In a church in Cambridgeshire, there is a plaque on the side of the church, which I have seen, a poem for Anna Maria, their first daughter, and I'll show you the grave of Joanna Vasa. He died in 1797. Short marriage. They were married only about 5 years. Till both the husband and the wife died. So what is this book? Is it a travelogue? Is it a slave narrative? Is it a memoir? Is it a spiritual narrative? It's all of those things, right? He was the most well-traveled African of the late 18th century. He began his journey unwillingly, as all slaves did who came to this country. And travel, the word travel connotes a voluntary, temporary change of environment. So some of the travel that he did was forced, but a lot of it was voluntary. So these are some of the places that he's been. We see that he's gone to Nova Scotia, that was in the book, California, Philadelphia, all down into West Indies several times. Tenerife, which is off the coast of Africa, to Turkey, Greece, and in farther climates. So he has very, very well traveled. So as I said, what genre is this? It is all of it. A spiritual autobiography, a captivity narrative, a travel book, an adventure tale, a rags to riches saga, and somebody said that it is more of a rags to riches saga than Ben Franklin's story. Ben Franklin has kind of a rags to riches, but Equiano's is more dramatic. It's an economic treatise, it's an apologia, and possibly some historical fiction, if you believe that. So we have talked about logos, ethos, and pathos, and I think his narrative is one of the best texts that I've ever seen to show how to use these kind of arguments in your persuasive argument. That is the grave of Joanna Vasa in Abney Park Cemetery. Can you shut it off for me? So we're going to go into teams now. I've redivided you up into teams.